Thing. Speaking of intentional futures, my name is Beth Freitas Clark. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the directors on our education practice here at IF. I am the product of a Title I funded public school or public schools throughout my education and a former classroom teacher, primarily in Title I funded public schools. In college, I was a full Pell Grant recipient, which is to say that I was poor, and I benefited from the education provided in part by the Federal Department of Education. That's a little about me, but you did not come here to hear from me. You came here to hear from our incredible guests, and so we will get to them in just a moment. Before we introduce our guests, I do want to ground us in some context for our conversation. I know folks are coming with varied kind of background in our federal education department, so we'll ground in a few moments of context. Then we'll move into our discussion, acknowledging that we can't cover everything. We can't talk about every group that could be impacted by the changes happening at the department today. But that doesn't mean it's not important. And we will end our time with some hot takes if we have time and some ideas from action that we're going to surface from our panelists and also from each of you who are here today. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into some background on the Department of Education. As these debates over the Department of Education's role intensify, it's important for us to kind of take a step back and think about how we got here. What is the purpose of the Department of Ed, and why is there a movement to dismantle it today? The idea of a federal education department is not new. In fact, Congress established the first Department of Education way back in 1867, just after the Civil War. It was quickly downgraded to an office within the Department of the Interior, and that was due to concerns over federal overreach. For decades then, education remained largely a state and local responsibility with limited federal involvement. That began to change in the 20th century. Education became increasingly tied to civil rights, economic opportunity, and national competitiveness. So there were a number of key federal education laws that expanded who was meant to be served by and included in public education, from the GI Bill, which prioritized higher ed for veterans, to Brown v. Board, which laid foundation for federal enforcement of desegregation and equal educational opportunity. Then in the 60s, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was a centerpiece of President Johnson's War on Poverty, came with it Title I, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, that provides funding for schools serving low-income communities. Title IX, which prohibits sex-based discrimination, reshaped opportunities for women and girls in schools and colleges. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act guaranteed that children with disabilities have the right to a free and appropriate public education. All of these laws laid the groundwork for a federal role in ensuring equitable access to education, and it paved the way for the Department of Education to be reestablished. Before 1979, federal education programs were scattered across multiple agencies at the federal level, and there was no cohesive oversight. So advocates pushed for a cabinet-level department to streamline these efforts. President Jimmy Carter signed the Department of Education Organization Act, which officially created the Department of Education again in 1979. And its mission was to distribute federal funding to states and districts equitably, to enforce civil rights laws and protect students from discrimination, to ensure that federal funds supplement rather than replace state and local education spending, and to collect and analyze education data to guide policy decisions. Since then, ED has played a central role in ensuring that all students, regardless of income, race, gender, disability status, or geography, receive equal educational opportunities. Obviously, we know that isn't always the case in reality, but that is where the work is focused. It's also important for us to kind of understand or note that while much of the conversation around dismantling ED focuses on implications for K-12, the department does play a role in both early childhood as well as post-secondary education. Although early childhood education is largely overseen by the Department of Health and Human Services, they administer Head Start and Child Care Development Block Grants, ED does play a role in ensuring access and quality in the publicly funded preschool programs. At the post-secondary level, ED is responsible for overseeing federal student aid programs. That includes things like Pell Grants, federal student loans, and work-study programs. They also ensure accreditation, consumer protections, and civil rights compliance. But despite its role in distributing federal funding, enforcing civil rights, ensuring accountability, and so on, the department has been a political flashpoint since its inception. Some argue that it represents federal overreach. Others believe it's critical to protecting students and to ensuring education access and quality. The push to dismantle the Department of Education is clearly not new, but it has gained momentum in recent years. The Trump administration has proposed eliminating the department entirely, and others continue to argue that education should be returned to state control. Many of the current proposals are aimed at reducing federal oversight, cutting funding, and shifting responsibilities to states. When we talk about dismantling the Department of Education, we're not talking about abolishing it. To dismantle something means to destroy the integrity or functioning of that thing. And while the last month is a reminder to never say never, the likelihood that ED will be abolished is quite low. To do so would take a supermajority of Congress. Similarly, IDEA, Title IX, and other federal laws I mentioned earlier were passed by Congress, so a president cannot repeal, amend, or completely defund them. What this administration can do, however, is to destroy the integrity or the functioning of the Department of Ed through executive action. This could include things like weakening enforcement of civil rights laws, rolling back federal oversight on state accountability by issuing waivers for states or institutions to opt out of certain requirements. Could look like restructuring, weaponizing, or cutting the budgets of offices such as the Office for Civil Rights, or diverting funds away from public schools toward choice initiatives like private school vouchers. And so those are some of the things we're going to get into today. Ultimately, we want to talk about what this would mean for students, for educators, and for communities if the department's role were reduced or stripped away. We're going to talk about the rights and the resources that are at stake, especially for those who are furthest from educational equity. So you're probably done hearing from me now. We want to introduce our panelists. I am honored to introduce these folks to you. Hopefully you've already had a chance to read their bios, so I asked them not to provide their full CV today, but instead to give a brief intro, as well as one thing that's giving them hope today. As they're introducing themselves, we also want to invite each of you who are attending to drop one word or one phrase of something that's giving you hope today, and it does not have to be related to education. So let's welcome our panelists. And Brenda, could you please start and introduce yourself?
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Beth, and to the Intentional Futures team. I'm Brenda Calderon. I am the former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Department of Education, overseeing the K-12 office that's tasked with early learning to college and career readiness. And my background is as a former English learner and ESL teacher, and have worked in policy advocacy for the last decade. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming from Alexandria, Virginia. And something that's giving me hope right now is organizing.
Thank you, Brenda. Misi.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are at. My name is Misi Fairfax. I'm a strategy director here. She, her pronouns. I reside in Burlington, Vermont. And my work is really rooted in many places and many different histories beyond my own. I come from a lineage of firsts and fighters. I was a trio student and a failed McNair. I didn't go through to the PhD, but definitely moved through many doors that weren't meant for me. I started in healthcare, but also realized that education is a health determinant and that access to information is vital, not just for opportunity, but for survival. So my work has spanned community-based organizations, hospitals, ed tech, and national policy areas. And I like to talk more about untangling the barriers we call policy and exposing the gaps we call oversight. As a strategy director at Complete College America, I lead efforts in student basic needs, digital access, and equitable AI. I co-lead the council there. I serve on Vermont's Disability Caucus, and I'm a member of the Royal Community College Alliance, working nationally to shape policies and practices that truly support students. What's given me hope is really about the opportunity to build some real community here. Because that's really what changes lives. So really pleased to be here, and thank you.
Thanks, Misi, and agree. Melissa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Wilk. I'm calling in from Oregon. I have a doctorate in educational leadership. I also have a master's in culturally responsive teaching. And I, too, am a TRIO graduate and a proud community college graduate and a non-traditional student. And so I'm so thankful to be here today. And something that is giving me hope. As a teacher who has pivoted from working in Title I rural schools across Oregon into policy and legislation, something that gives me hope is just the curiosity and the pragmatic optimism to say people have been resilient for a very long time, fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I draw strength from them. I draw strength from us.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And Reed.
Hi, I'm Reed Saris. I'm here in Washington State, and what motivates me in my work is ensuring that the best of what our systems have to offer reach all students. Like my best friend, like my foster sister growing up, and have done that work as a teacher, a school administrator, founder and CEO of Equal Opportunity Schools, where we partnered closely with the Obama White House and the Department of Education. At that time, I've also worked on youth mental health, and most recently on the Washington State Governor's Transition Committee, focused on expanding access and opportunities for kids. Oh, and what's giving me hope is some of that local state leadership work, like Ali G mentioned in the chat there. We have a bill to prevent social media companies from targeting kids. We have a bill to provide universal access to mental health care. And so those sorts of things are things that we can still get done.
Thanks so much, Reed. And I do want to let y'all know, Melissa had to drop off due to a family emergency, so feel free to send your energy her way as we continue to engage in this conversation. But we appreciate her energy in preparing for this conversation for sure. Well, hopefully, as you heard and read, our panelists have a broad range of, not hopefully they have experiences, hopefully you read and hopefully you heard. They do, in fact, have a broad range of experiences from which they'll be speaking today. And we know that many of you in this room could also be a part of this panel and speak to the different perspectives that are and experiences that are represented today. So we hope to engage some of you in future conversations as well. But we are going to jump into kind of our moderated Q&A portion. And again, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We did receive some questions in advance, which we tried to incorporate in various ways today. You've already heard some answers to some of those questions in the intro, and we'll get to some others now. So firstly, let's talk about the Office for Civil Rights. This is one division of the Department of Education. OCR's mission is to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence through vigorous enforcement of civil rights in our nation's schools. The OCR is codified in federal legislation, and therefore it would take Congress to shutter it. However, we've already seen significant shifts in what's being enforced by the OCR, and we are likely to see a reduction to their funding, to their staffing, and other meaningful changes in the months and years to come. When you think about the changes that have already been rolled out and the potential changes to OCR in the future, what rights do you think are at stake? And how might that play out for students and for families? Brenda, I'd love for you to speak to this first, please.
Sure. I think all of our critical civil rights protection are at stake. I work very closely with the Office of Civil Rights and their purview over Title VI non-discrimination in particular. Every office is sort of tasked with overseeing their section on the law, and OCR is very unique in that they not only have the technical expertise around the civil rights provisions, but also IDEA, our enforcement around students with disabilities and making sure that they are in the least restrictive environment, that they're included in other services and are provided the same services that other students who don't have disabilities may be able to have, as well as our English learners, and that they are not discriminated against, national origins and other protections they have under Title VI. And so I think it's critical that OCR's oversight capacity and their ability to go into school districts and investigate and oversee some consent decrees that some of these school districts are under is extremely critical. I also want to emphasize that civil rights data collection is under OCR's purview, and that helps us understand disparities around educators, disparities around disciplinary practices, seclusion for students with disabilities. And so if that particular office is gutted or dismantled due to lack of staffing or minimizes staffing, I think we can see we'll lose access to those critical data points that help us shine a light onto these systemic inequities.
Yeah, building on that, absolutely agree on the civil rights data collection in particular. And we got to work with Russell and Ali, who was just an incredible champion leading the Office of Civil Rights in the Obama administration, building out some aspects of the data collection. And I think it's important to note, the achievement gap has been in the conversation for decades. What the civil rights data collection enables us to do is get to the opportunity gap underneath an achievement gap. And that information, as Brenda was mentioning, really articulating who's getting access to quality teaching, who's getting access to rigorous curriculum, who's getting excluded, like all of these factors that without the civil rights data collection go unreported on a systemic basis, I think allows people to misuse achievement gap data and actually blame communities and really reinforce false narratives when really we need to be exposing what's happening underneath in terms of the unequal opportunities that are out there for kids and families. And so OCR and the Civil Rights Data Collection has enabled people to see those things systemically at every single school in the United States in a comparative framework. There's just no substitute for that exists in the country, and it stopped under the previous Trump administration. They stopped reporting on these disparities in opportunity, and just got rebooted under the last administration. And so I think that's a big hole that is likely to reemerge as it did earlier.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to this a little bit about what's happening on the ground, right? So when we're thinking about our schools, universities, and colleges, right? So, they spoke, Reed and Brenda spoke to, the right to equal education processes, to due process, accessible education. But I really want to talk to the right to protection from harassment and bullying. So when we're talking about this release of this information and these changes, what we're doing is that we're seeing there's a lot of emboldened actors and even students who are actively harassing, or as we saw at Temple University, where a former student impersonated an ICE agent and did an ICE raid. So even in real time, as we think about what is happening at our campuses, or even the conversations that we need to have, we know that this is also, there is not a concerted effort in terms of how to enforce this. We know at Los Manitos College, they talked about bracing for the possibility of ICE raids. The University of Minnesota said that they would comply with federal court orders, where there's other ones who talked about being sanctuary universities, but can they really uphold that? So there's really, talking about in the post-secondary landscape, there really is some real concerns on the ground in terms of just making sure that we can support our students and then protect their mental well-being while they are trying to do and to attain their studies.
Thanks, Saul. Melissa was really hoping to speak about our rural communities and the impact that they are going to feel. One of the things that the federal government does is to supplement rural communities, because there are a lot of ways in which our laws are structured where, for example, certain farmlands taxes cannot be collected from those farmlands. And so the federal government also supplements those communities. Students in rural communities deserve the same high quality education, and without the funding provided from the federal level, that's also something that we need to think about, is how are these individual students being impacted? Our rural communities are increasingly diverse. Our rural communities are in so many ways thriving despite, decreasing populations, despite their, challenges that they face often with poverty. And so we need to make sure that there is some oversight to ensure that there is access, that the data is being shared about how these students are doing, how they're being impacted. Speaking of data, I'm going to jump to, a slightly adjacent topic, but, we know that states and post-secondary institutions have certain data reporting expectations. They have to share all kinds of data for a myriad of reasons, to provide the public with insights on affordability, to help us understand the return on investment when we're at the post-secondary level, to measure student progress, to measure school success, and who is succeeding and who is not succeeding in this environment. To enforce civil rights, which y'all have already, brought up, especially where public monies are being used. Without this kind of accountability, without this kind of data sharing, what other changes might we see for students and families? And Reed, do you want to start off speaking about some of the other challenges you didn't have a chance to get to?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I was mentioning earlier, it's hard to see these issues without any comparative reporting. And so, and this ties into the funding piece too. I started out early in the Education Trust and really learned a lot of the frameworks there. And they talk about access to quality teachers, rigorous curriculum, and funding, and those being the sort of triumvirate of the disparities in opportunity and how we resource our system. And so you may take a student who's low income and say, hey, let me see where they are, what they need, et cetera. But if you, as a school system, exacerbate those challenges by giving less resources to those students, then you're perpetuating and exacerbating the inequity. And so those are the sorts of things that I think came from the data reporting, from starting with the achievement gap data. Let's disaggregate the data on things like literacy to the point where the U.S. Department of Education has been the lead voice in really disaggregating those core opportunity gaps and reporting on them. Absent that data, it's very hard to tell. So you look at a school system and you may say, hey, I can't really see the disparities in who's getting access to what. And one of the key ones actually was pushed under the previous two administrations ago, where they started to report on the finance piece. And the finance piece is absolutely key, right? Title I, as Beth was talking about earlier, is intended to supplement resources for lower income students. Unfortunately, the way that the states have been reporting data historically continues to obscure the fact that we are generally under-resourcing low-income students, even with the federal monies on top. And so we did an analysis in the state of Washington recently. We found lower-income students get 16% less money than other students in the state of Washington. And so the data to be able to see that just became available due to pushes from the U.S. Department of Education to insist that we actually get the data on funding at the school level within districts, and you can see those disparities and where district decision makers, state decision makers, and otherwise decide to perpetuate those opportunity gaps and exacerbate those issues rather than resolve them.
Brenda, I'm sure you have thoughts on this one, so I do want to make space for you. And I think that the point I want to really hone in on that you're mentioning, Reed, is if we don't have someone forcing this data to be shared out, then this data that we just got access to could be the last we see for the next 4 or more years, right? Because these doors are being shuttered. And so while we may have this data from this year and that's helpful, we still need to know, okay, what changes might be made. And that's going to apply across everything we're discussing today. It might take a moment, a day, a signature to undo something. It's going to take a lot longer to bring all those things back in, like the restaffing, the refunding, the reprogramming of all the things. Brenda, what might you add?
I want to add that data is an oversight mechanism from the department. In my previous role at I worked under in the Obama administration, I did some of the oversight work. We use data to help us understand how states and districts were complying with federal law. So I'll tell a funny story, but we were looking at the results of the assessment data, and we thought there was an error because one of the states had not submitted their assessments. It turns out they'd never administered the assessment, which is a huge, huge red flag. And so that helped us sort of, begin a series of monitoring and compliance and helping the state sort of come to compliance with their federal requirements. And so having that data is important for the Department of Education to help understand how states are in fact implementing the law as written by Congress. I think that's another critical component here, that the department just doesn't have authority to sort of just do whatever they want with federal K-12. That is mandated by Congress, and how these funds are administered, how Title I is administered, or Title II, Title III, these big pots of funding that are helping our low-income students, our teacher professional development, our English learners, or after school programs have a set of requirements in terms of how that money has to be spent, and what sorts of expectations are required for states and districts. And so the data is very critical to helping us understand whether states are doing that or not. And the department provides that technical assistance to help states understand how that needs to be how that needs to be implemented or correct when there are inequities happening, such as resource inequities, which was a big priority of ours over the last the last 4 years, to make sure that students are in fact getting the resources available to them, and that the funding is in fact supplementary to what the states and the districts are providing, and there is not a divestment in education funding.
Yeah, and then Beth, I just wanted to add just 2 more things I think are important to think about here as well, is that we know that with the changes that are happening, that this could also allow for-profit entities to creep back into the space in the way that they had not been. And that is really telling in terms of just the skill building and just the access for our students, and protecting our students as well. And then the other thing I also want to talk about is when we think about largely this body of work is also about we're talking about AI and the disruption it's having within higher education. And so that resource allocation of who and how has access to it, who's able to get skill building and have the built-in curriculum, right? Because we also know that that's a workforce development issue as well, is going to be very critical. So this is happening at a very, very tough time. And then last thing I would add too is that, CCA as an organization and many others were really about completion rates. Completion rates have been abysmal for quite some time, and we've seen some of it improving. But what I would say, though, is that we're now at a point where many folks have set 2025, 2030 goals, still a bit far away from that. So what is that going to look like in terms of the ways that we're reaching to make those goals, and the data and the transparency and accountability to do right by our students and our communities?
Yeah, that's right, Nisi. And I appreciate the ways each of you, while talking about policy, are grounding in students. These are real students who are impacted, and the outcomes for these students because of the changes to funding. And Brenda, I appreciate you kind of reminding us that Congress is the one who ultimately kind of decides how certain funds are used. So this isn't just about one, kind of department dictating you must do ABC. The states still do have a lot of control. And in fact, a lot of the funding also comes from the states. So, nationally, according to the 2021-2022 school year data, about 13 to 14% of public school funding came from the federal government. So a smaller, percentage. And the federal government, part of the Department of Ed's role is to say, states, you can't stop funding education. You still have to make sure you're investing in, the children who live in your states and in the young people who live in your states. That $125 billion coming from the federal government, we may see a reduction in those monies. And y'all have spoken already about some of the ways that we may see that funding reduced. I know we had some questions specifically that folks were asking about post-secondary impacts. What might happen if we see a reduction in funding? And Misi, I'm curious how you've been thinking about how students can access higher education if there is a reduction to funding.
Yeah, well, when we think about equity is always kind of framed, and even higher education is framed as a ladder to opportunity. And, sadly, without federal support, too many students will find that ladder broken. So at the core of that access is the Pell Grants. That's a critical financial aid program, right? That ensures low-income students, many of them who are first-gen, they're students of color, adult learners, disproportionately caregiving students, a third who are mostly community college students. We're talking about students with disability, rural, the list goes on. Those are in place to make sure that they have a real chance at education. And so it's not just about the money for the tuition, right? It's a gateway to economic mobility. And yet largely, right, the idea of the dismantling of the ed department puts the very structure of Pell at risk, either by limiting funding or shifting oversight or complicating the administration of it. And so unfortunately, that's creating uncertainty, that's creating barriers where there should be stability and access. But we also know that access alone is not enough, right? So even when we think about our NCAN organizations that went from access to achievement, right? We think about getting students in college with those supports, need to help them persist and complete. And that's getting them to a degree without debt. And we want to make sure that we give them and are supporting their effort and giving them rewards. We also talked about earlier where folks talked about the federal grants used on student completion and retention, right? So talking about TRIO, Gear Up, Title III, Title V, right? So we have heard folks who have been awarded these where they've been stalled, right? Or they don't know if they're going to be getting those fundings. Those ensure, again, that those historically excluded students have the advising, the mentoring, and the academic supports really needed to reach graduation day. And so dismantling the Department of Ed is not going to be as seemingly life and death as it is with the USA Department, but we also do know that education is a determinant, right? So it's not just about stripping financial aid. It's also about the disruption this is going to have for our entire infrastructure that we've built to help students succeed. And the last thing I really want to talk about is the real momentum that we've seen in evidence-based strategies. So when we talk about the institution of education sciences, right? That we're boosting completion rates, that we're adding to the What Works clearinghouse. This was data that was used to identify barriers, target interventions, and then technology to make those pathways clearer and more navigable. And so that's a real concern. And then the last thing I'll say, though, people have talked about all the work that they've done with pathways, right? And this is essentially blowing up those pathways. It's forcing states, institutions, and students to have a navigated pathway. And we also know that when states, even though they're giving the lion's share of the funding, we know that they don't give it in the right way. So when we talk about how and what's happening, one example is to look at the Indiana governor who came in and took away $5 million from the HBCU, right? That's the recent case, but that won't be the only case. And so for us, it's really the way that we're viewing it. It's a step backwards in time, and we made so much progress, but it's really abysmal to see where we're at this moment.
Yeah, thanks, Macy. And we are, we're seeing at the kind of higher end of education, all of these impacts for students and the ways that, if we want to think about our future, if we want to think about our workforce, we do need to make sure that there's still funding going to allow folks to access these higher education opportunities. On the other end of the spectrum, we also know that the kind of prime time to reach students in their education is in early childhood. And while a lot of the, kind of funding and governing doesn't come from the Department of Education, we know that the Department of Education does play a role, especially for young children who have disabilities. And so the Department of Ed still does play a role in early childhood education. Brenda, I'm curious if you might help us think about how would dismantling the Department of Ed affect early childhood education programs and affect access for families?
I will say that there is only one federal agency that is tasked with ensuring that all students can succeed, and that's the U.S. Department of Education. So dismantling ed would be incredibly disastrous for our students, for our families, and for the future of our country. One of the issues that I worked on was very critical to President Biden was expanding access to preschool and early childhood education. We know how critical that is for families to be able to have low to no cost access to early childhood education. And the evidence does also show us that high quality access at an early age and that continuity through the early grades, so through grade 3, is incredibly helpful in helping all students succeed and in closing achievement gaps. There is currently federal funding available to do that. We know that about 1.5 million students are currently served in preschools that are funded by Title I. We did a big push and issued guidance around expanding access to preschool through the use of Title I dollars, which is the biggest pot of funding authorized by Congress to help students in need. In addition to Title I, there's also funding available through IDEA, both Part B and Part C. Part B expands access to preschool for students with disabilities, and Part C offers additional funding to support infants and toddlers. Currently, about 400,000 infants and toddlers are being served with Part C dollars, and about 500,000 preschoolers are served through Part B. So we know that early identification, early services is helpful in addressing students with disabilities' individual unique needs and helping them set them up for success so that they can learn and succeed. I will also say one of the key partnerships that was critical at the U.S. Department of Education was our role in coordination with Health and Human Services. We worked collaboratively to ensure that when there were statements coming from either agencies, that they were dual statements, so both had so that the statements had the signatures of both the Secretary at the Department of Education and the Secretary at HHS, and those included statements around inclusion inclusion practices, particularly for students with disabilities, statements around dual language learners, which we know is very important to be able to identify students that may need language supports in the early grades, and that those supports be carried out through elementary school. And so those unique partnerships, I think, are critical in ensuring that states and districts are receiving the federal supports they need to make sure that we are supporting our littlest learners.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. There's a lot more we could say about all of these questions, but I do want to move to our final question because I think it's one that a lot of folks have top of mind, and one that actually a few folks submitted in their registration form as well. But there's a lot of effort and energy to dismantle the department, obviously, for various reasons, some of which we named and some of which we didn't get to. Is there a way to reform the Department of Education that might address critics' concerns and still maintain certain critical federal functions, such as enforcing civil rights, ensuring access to education? Or perhaps another way to think about the question would be, are there ways to streamline Ed's role that might garner bipartisan support? And it's okay if your answer is no, but would be curious to hear, what can we do? What shifts can we make at the department level that might make folks feel a little more comfortable with how things are going? Reed, I'd love to start with you, please.
Sure. I don't have a great answer, so looking forward to hearing from other colleagues. It's a big question and something I'm still thinking about. And I think it's the right question because it's interesting. I know my colleagues on the panel and myself are fierce advocates for kids who've been underserved. And to some extent, this political strategy at the national level could have us appearing to be defenders of the status quo, which we're not. We're fierce advocates for kids who've been underserved, and how do we solve those challenges? And so I think that's exactly the right question to ask and think about. What is the vision? And as I mentioned before, for example, a remit of the U.S. Department of Education and Title I and some of the initial pieces are things like lower income kids should have extra resources. And the fact that the U.S. Department of Education, as currently configured, has not even got to equal resources for low-income kids is, I think, a big challenge to that. And so I think the appetite in America, left side and some on the right, otherwise, is how can we do better? And I think we're challenged to answer that question, not just say, as I've fallen in the trap of myself of, don't get rid of OCR. I love OCR. I need OCR for my work to show these disparities. But what are we going to do so that those opportunity gaps get closed? How are we in a U.S. Department of Education as advocates outside of the system or otherwise really going to lift up those stories of places where it is a truly equitable system, where they have closed gaps? How are we going to share and spread those practices in ways that there have been times and moments in the U.S. Department of Education when it has really lifted up that work and made those things successful? But I don't think any of us on the panel are satisfied with the progress to closing those gaps. And so I think it's exactly the right question, and one that I'm thinking about and interested to learn more from the panelists about.
Thanks, Reed. There's a lot for all of us are concerned about in terms of how things are going. Misi?
Yeah. I wish I could be a bit more optimistic, right? Given where and how and what's happening at the moment, I do realize, and to Reed's point about the left and the right, there are some shared concerns that aren't always appreciated, but they come across in really varied ways. And so even as we talked about transparency and accountability, return on investment, folks are acting more like consumers and investors in terms of the education. What am I actually getting back? Curricular relevance is of concern, and then just workforce and economic development. So I think there's places where we can learn and have conversations, but I just don't know within this Congress if this is going to be something that we can come together on. I'm hopeful for it. The one thing I would say, just to address someone saying about the dismantling, there's so many ties behind the scene. So even as I think about basic needs and to tie into some of that research that happens with NIH, right? So many of these tenants may move to different offices and have different places that are providing oversight. But I think the larger thing as we think about where and what could potentially be a path forward, I'm not sure if we have the right folks in the right place to do that. If it's going to be the Dodge, well, we better hold our breath and hope that other folks come in to be a part of this conversation, or that there is some bipartisan committees and others who are part of this. So it's not a satisfying answer, I'm sure, for many on the call, because I honestly, I haven't seen anything like this before. And I think we should also be very connected to resources and people who can support us and lift us up as we're going through this.
Thanks, Missy. Brenda?
I don't think efficiencies are finding efficiencies is sort of a negative thing. I think we can always work to be more efficient. I think one of the misunderstandings is how big the Department of Education is. Our staffing levels when I left, and this was under the Biden-Harris administration, were actually smaller than what they were under the Obama administration. And if you think about the scope of our work and the new laws that we've had to implement, such as all of the COVID relief programs, the three major COVID relief programs, including the American Rescue Plan, which was one of the largest investments in federal K-12, as well as the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which provides mental health supports and additional supports for mental health professionals in schools. We did not have the amount of staff that we needed to implement those laws appropriately. And so staffing was already a huge concern, even under the previous administration. It's going to continue to be a concern, I think, given some of the cuts that we're seeing are being reported around staffing. Right now is also not a time to underfund or defund education. I think we have a national imperative right now, looking at the NAEP scores and where we need to be, and also still coming off of COVID recovery here. We really need to focus on ensuring additional investments in students. I think one of the task force that I was on at the department prior to leaving the administration was looking at how we can better integrate AI to create efficiencies in terms of processes, so that our staff can focus on their oversight roles. We can use their technical expertise to be working more closely with states and helping them implement these requirements, or helping them interpret the law, versus doing some of the more tedious work that we know that technology can help us use. And so I think there is an opportunity there to better utilize technology, and the affordances created through technology at the federal level without reductions in force, which I think is the direction that this administration will be taking.
Thank you. A lot of unsatisfying answers. Not that your answers weren't great, but I think it's clear that there's not an easy answer. There's not an obvious answer to this question, and to this crisis that we're facing. I see a few folks have kind of dropped some thoughts in the chat, which I haven't been able to consume entirely, as I'm also listening to folks. But I'm sure there are a lot of ways that we might think about this question. I do want to shift to some of our great audience questions. I think we have time for at least one of them, which is, has anyone confirmed that there's someone out there who's going to download all the ed data and that it's getting downloaded as a backup, like, whoops, now it's moving on my screen, like what happened with the CDC? We might lose access to lots of very important data sets that we're used to calling up frequently.
I'm not aware of any specific organization that has taken this on, but I would encourage all stakeholders out there to download any information that you need from the Department of Education now. That includes all of our guidance, all of the data sets that are available while they're still available, to download them yourselves or through your organization, or to coordinate to make sure that there's a repository of that data. We just don't know how long it's going to be available for.
Yeah, and I know, I'll just say, looking at our guest list today, I know there are a number of folks who might be able to fund that kind of an effort. So I'll just put that call out there as well, because I know it's going to take a lot of energy, resources, coordination to do something like that. But if we want that data, not just last year's data, but other historical data, it could get lost. Yeah, thanks for that question. And there's another question here. As control would head to states to determine how to serve our most marginalized students, is there any sense of which states might collaborate or work in affinity together towards advocacy in areas such as ECE, special ed, or serving ELs, generally ways to explore creative approaches in their shared pursuit? So thinking about the coordination of states. Reed, I'm sure you had some experience with that. Misi and Brenda, I'm sure you've kind of seen different perspectives as well. So this is a really interesting question, and I'll just open the floor for whoever feels equipped.
Yeah, there is some collaboration among states in the West, and our new governor, I think, said on his upon his election, he has more experience than anybody else in the country suing the Trump administration from his time as Attorney General. He started against the travel ban on the first days last time around. So there are certainly both attorneys general coalitions and gubernatorial coalitions working on a variety of these things. As far as education in particular, I think it's a bit more challenging. I just think that there has been a lot of lost momentum in the last 8 years or so around this topic, and fragmentation of state approaches that should we be testing on things like reading and math? Should we be like all of these sorts of questions that have made it difficult for people to have that really in-depth comparative conversation, and then a lot of progress, in some surprising places on things like literacy that more blue-leaning states have not been making. And so there's just really not as much of a coherence to the movement around education as I think we've seen historically. That makes it a time that is difficult to go through these sorts of conversations in particular.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I would just add, CCA, we're an alliance of 53 state systems and consortium. So a variety of folks are coalescing around us and our body of work. But then there's also, to Reed and others' points about the AG offices, right? Like, so when you see those forces combined, those are also the ones who are having some of those conversations about education in the background too. And so, as you mentioned, with some of the red and blue states, and then even just some of the purple in between, when thinking about my home state of Pennsylvania, right? So you see folks in terms of those regions, those areas reaching out and supporting to each other, depending on what that is. And then the largely thing I would say too, right? Because we're also in the midst of anti-DEI, right, framing and all of that going on as well. And so in terms of those who are coalescing together, they've shifted their terms, but they haven't shifted their values. So even in that body of work, as they continue to find ways to make sure that, when there's open records request and all of those things, in terms of just those ways to support each other and make sure that they're out in front of it. And so for anyone who's on the line and wants to connect or wants to hear specifically about connecting with institutions, I know myself and our colleagues will have places for you to reach out or just to learn more.
Yeah, thanks, Misi. And I think this idea of collaborating across states, across institutions, is one that brings us to our closing question for you all. And this is a question where we're also going to invite some ideas from all of our guests today. So the question, and it's actually similar to what Jasmine asked in the chat as well. Our last question is, when you think about the conversation we're having today and the climate in which we find ourselves, what is one concrete action everyday community members can take right now? So in the chat, feel free to drop just a quick line. I'm going to limit our panelists as well to 1 to 2 sentences. But what is something that we can do now? Just everyday community members. They might not be a politician. They might not have access to philanthropic dollars, and on and on and on. But what can we all do? Brenda?
I would say reach out to your legislators, reach out to your Congress members, tell your stories. I think when the freeze came up a couple weeks ago on all federal funding, there was an immense outcry from community members around the impact of Head Start funding, of school funding, all of our federal funding, and how important and critical that is for communities across the country. I mean, rural communities in Alaska to urban communities in New York. everyone is impacted by this work, and it's so important to be able to tell the story about how important and critical federal funding is to meeting the needs of all students and ensuring that all students can succeed. So your voices and your agency is important no matter where you sit.
Thank you. Reed?
Yeah, it's somewhat in the chat and people have been talking about it earlier, but I think the OCR civil rights data collection, depending on whatever level you're at, if you're looking at the national file, if you're looking at the local file, you can see things like who has access to algebra, who has access to the wide variety of resources, who's getting excluded from school, and how does that vary based on the background of students. And you can take that to your local school principal. You can take that to your school district board meeting. You can take that to your state schools chief. You can operate at any level. And that data, as folks have talked about, is, some of it is downloadable, but right now you can still search every single school in the United States and see the types of disparities that are driving some of the biggest challenges in our K-12 systems. I encourage folks to check out your own school, district, state, or deal with the file nationally, because those are the things that people can pull levers on still and push on for equal opportunities for kids.
Yeah, thank you, Reed. Macy?
I mean, +1, +2, right, in terms of what they said already, so I won't repeat that, but I will just say that this is really a moment of getting our citizenry, my gosh, that's a word, more engaged, so civic engagement. So just largely, this may not be the way that we wanted it, but I do see how folks are much more engaged in their local and their state. So again, keep reaching out. And then also in terms of the way that you engage with others as you learn more about this, right? So our communities start with us and the neighbors and everyone around us. And those are our footholds. And so when I talked earlier about what's my hope about actually doing the big letter C community, this is it. This is actually our moment to coalesce as a group together, to have the same messaging, the same framing, and to make some gains in ways, even though this dismantling is not the way that we have intended, there are some gains and some progress that we can make in our resistance.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hear definitely a lot of folks saying stay engaged and speak up and say something to someone, whether it's at the school principal level, down the street, or at the, maybe it's at the board meeting in your district, maybe it's to someone at the state level or the federal level, but speaking up and speaking out. Also, I've noticed a few comments in the chat about students and remembering to center students and their stories and their experiences, and keeping that central. That's what this is about. It's about the students. It's about the families who are impacted. And my kind of tidbit would be to watch out for each other. Think about those who are in your community who you might be able to support, and how you speak with them about how you can advocate for them, how you can support them in this time. There is, of course, so much we did not get to cover today, but Reed, Brenda, Macy, I want to thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us today, sharing your, just experiences and wisdom. Also, thank you to everyone who is contributing in the chat. I would like to keep that open. In just a moment, we'll close out. I do appreciate everyone for attending today, and we know that there were even more folks who signed up to receive the recording, but we're just so grateful for everyone's presence. Again, shout out to our panelists, shout out to the Intentional Futures team who is working behind the scenes today. We do hope that you will all continue to act, to talk, and to not give up. We grounded in hope. So let's hang on to those things that are giving us hope. Again, my name is Beth. I'm one of the directors here at Intentional Futures. We have the privilege of working in the pre-K through post-secondary space. At times, that looks like our team actively engaging with the people directly impacted by our clients' work, whether that's products or programs, to surface insights that will ensure that our recommendations are equitable and truly address students and other users' needs. Sometimes our team is out there conducting market research on EdTech innovations to uncover trends, challenges, and opportunities that help ed-focused organizations make informed decisions. We also work with our partners to align on their strategy and get buy-in from key stakeholders, and lots of other things. There's a link in the chat. You can feel free to visit our website. But mostly we came here today just to get some conversation going. We hope that this is not the end of the conversation for you. We hope that you will engage with others in your community about the things that matter most to them. So thank you again. We just appreciate your time today. Take good care, everyone.